All right, my tech people tell me that it's 11:25, that clock is 1 minute slow, so we will start. A couple of class notes before we get going. Next Sunday, we will celebrate Easter together, so we will not have class. The following Sunday, on April 12th, will feature a historical session with Paul Husenfeld speaking on why the Dutch emigrated to North America. Looking ahead, some of you have asked about the rescheduling of a session that we had earlier that was preempted by the Lament session, which was on funerals here, the meaning of and the background and what goes into the planning and such, conducted by our pastoral staff, and that will be April 19. So that has been rescheduled. Last week, Dr. John Hubers led us in an exploration of the term religion, and I promised I had plenty more background information. So here goes. For one period of his professional life, from 2001 to 2006, John served as supervisor of the RCA's mission programs in the Middle East. In that role, he offered pastoral and administrative supervision for 18 RCA missionaries in the Middle East and South Asia. He visited RCA churches following the 9/11 attacks to help educate congregations on the development of positive Christian-Muslim relations. And he performed a whole list of other duties related to the second part of his position, was promoting the global mission program of the RCA in 155 churches in the Synod of the Heartland. Adding to this, to his mission work in Bahrain, Oman, Ethiopia, his teaching career, his pastoral work, you have a very interesting resume, and I'd commend it to you. It's on the internet. And thanks for being with us, John.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you. Yeah, and once again, she makes me tired. By the way, I have to tell you, this job I had for 5 years supervising missionaries, here's a dirty little secret. Missionaries are difficult people to deal with. I can say that now I'm retired. It doesn't matter. It won't redound upon me anymore. So last week we talked about the definition of religion and came up with hopefully a workable definition, finding out how difficult it is to define religion. I think my favorite saying was, everyone knows what religion is until someone asks them to define it. And it's very, very difficult, particularly because the phenomena of religion has so many different varieties. It's hard to find one way of describing all that phenomena. And George and I had an interesting discussion afterwards about what we call indigenous religions. And we're both missiologists. We both have taught this stuff, and it's interesting. We didn't necessarily come to a full agreement on that, which just underlines how difficult it is to figure out how to define religion. We have to continue that discussion, George. It's a good one. Indigenous religions, by the way, I love to talk about indigenous religions. It wasn't on our list of major world religions, and it probably should have been, partly because it's so tied to one particular place. And that's why we use the words indigenous religions, because it takes on different forms in the many places it is. But if we want to talk about a universal religion, that is indigenous religions everywhere in the world. And that includes, I love to tell people this, I love to tell my students this, just realize that somewhere in your family history, going back long enough, your ancestors were worshiping spirits in the trees, because all those Dutch people, they didn't become Calvinists, right away. So really, the most, we have a Dutch couple here, so I hope I didn't just slander you. But it really is the most universal religion, because before all of the now, quote, world religions, that define the religious life of people around the world. So we'll just keep that there, because that's not going to be our discussion today, but it's an interesting side note. Today we're going to talk about the main topic I want to get to, which is how do we as Christians think of and approach other religions as, the institutional form of the religion, or other people. Now, I'm going to start with the people part, and I'm just going to set that aside. You shall love your neighbor as yourself should be the definitive approach we take to people of every faith. And we'll just leave it there, because we're going to be talking less about how to approach people than we are how do we understand, as a Christian, these other religions. How do we look at these other religions? And I'm going to start, if you remember, if you were here last week, I told you that I had my students do a tweet every week about the reading that they had. And when they did the reading for this particular session, one of my students tweeted this. He said, "I was quite surprised by the broad spectrum of the Christian perspectives on world religions." This was one of my more articulate students. At the exclusivism end, it is very specific to Christianity, with people believing Jesus is the light, and also calls for acts of repentance and faith. At the complete other end, the pluralism paradigm acknowledges that all religions have access to salvation. These are very different ways of thinking. And the first thing I said to my students was, I agree. These are very different ways of thinking. And you're going to see that. This is one of those classes that kind of blew my students' minds, because we're going to find out that Christians, and all of these are Christian responses to other religions. There are a lot of responses to other religions, but we're not talking about secular versions or Muslim versions or anything else. We're talking about Christians trying to come to grips with the plurality of religions around the world. And what we're going to find out is there's a spectrum of thinking, and they really are very different. So let's look at each one of them. And we're going to be using categories that have recently been established by a Catholic theologian known as Paul Knitter in this wonderful book called Theologies of Religion. Theologies of Religions, notice, because he's talking about the plurality of religions. Classic terms that have been used, and if you've ever read anything in this area of comparative studies of religions, you've probably come across these terms: exclusivist, inclusivist, and pluralist. The problem is there's a new fourth category that doesn't fit any of those three, and Knitter also decides those tend to be pejorative terms. Let's use terms that at least acknowledge that each one of these views has something worth considering. So he comes up with these terms: replacement, and he's going to talk about complete and partial replacement, fulfillment, mutuality, and acceptance. And what we're going to do today is to look at each one of these in turn, and I'm hoping to leave a good amount of time at the end to discuss where you might find yourself in these different paradigms. The first paradigm is what I would call the default paradigm, and especially for those of us who grew up in fairly traditional Protestant churches, but I go across the spectrum: Catholic, Orthodox, go around the world, and probably the majority of Christians would find themselves here. This is the replacement. What do we mean by replacement? It means that when the message of Christ was brought to the world, it replaced all other religious possibilities, because it is the truth. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me, is the central tenet of this particular viewpoint. And it talks about three non-negotiables. A, the uniqueness of Christ, unique to any other religious teaching and figure ever. That his death and resurrection was his central event of human history. And salvation is only by an act of repentance and faith commitment to Christ. There's no other way to come into a full saving relationship with God. And I'm referencing a Dutch missionary, theologian here, who's been gone for a while. He wrote basically a pamphlet. It's not a book, but he wrote it for a major missionary conference in 1938 called The Christian Message in a Non-Christian World. And it made quite a stir. It became quite controversial because basically he was saying the only way to understand other faiths is to think of it this way. And that is that all religions, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, revolve around a central teaching or a central figure. Now, in the case of Islam, Christianity, and Buddhism, it's Muhammad for Islam, not necessarily the person Muhammad, but his message is at the center of everything that flows out and is defined by Islam. Buddhism, the experience of Gautama, Siddhartha Gautama, who became the Buddha, defines everything that is a part of the Buddhist understanding of the world and who we are as human beings. And of course, for Christians, Christ is the centerpiece. And here's the controversial part. He said, all that each of these religions teaches is linked to that center point. So if I'm sitting and having a conversation with Muslims, we may be having a conversation. It seems like we're coming to an agreement. Oh, we agree on this, we agree on that. But what Kramer would say is, no, it's only an apparent agreement. In fact, when I sit down with a Muslim and have a conversation, we may think we're coming to an agreement, but because the centerpiece is Muhammad for Muslims and Christ for Christians, we actually aren't. And I'm illustrating it myself with circles here. Notice they don't touch. There's no point of agreement between any religions because they all emanate from a different core. All revolve around a central faith conviction. Similarities are apparent, not real. Christ is the full and salvific revelation lacking in other faiths. And by the way, I picked up all these words when I did my PhD studies. Salvific is not a word I use in normal conversation, but I hope you understand what it means, having to do with salvation. Christ alone is the full revelation lacking in other faiths. There's only one way. So this is a fairly stark understanding that all other religions are false. Christianity is the only true religion. Now, others who were dealing as missionaries in places where there were other faiths found that a little bit too extreme. And the exclusivist one is kind of out of favor in our more pluralist society. So there were other missionaries, particularly those who worked in India. And I love this guy's name, Monier Williams. If I had a son called Monier, I would not give him the middle name Monier. Anyway, he actually predated Kramer, who had been a missionary, by the way, a Dutch missionary in Indonesia. So his interaction with people of other faiths was mainly Islam. These missionaries said, that's too extreme. Because every religion has points of contact. And this is much more attractive because now I can sit down with my Muslim friend and talk about God and realize we do have things in common because we're dealing with a common reality. So that all religions have, notice touch points, the circles here, that overlap. However, at the same time, we affirm those non-negotiables. So they're still talking about replacement, Christianity replacing all other religions, but they do say that there is in other religions universal God-given instincts, desires, and aspirations that are met in the Christian gospel. So if I'm having a conversation with a Hindu and we're talking about God, he may hear something in the gospel that I'm sharing with him that will resonate with his own faith and may become a point of contact that will lead that person into accepting Jesus as their Lord and Savior. So we're still in a very much a traditional missionary mode in this understanding. So we're really looking here. Still, I would say if we go around the world, have conversations with Christians from many different backgrounds, many would say that this is their standpoint. But then, as we begin to think that there might be points of contact with other religions, we're led to think that maybe we need to go a little bit further. And a little bit further in this case begins to move us more into contemporary times when the pluralism that used to be out there, see, it was missionaries talking out there. We didn't know anything about Hindus. We didn't know anything about Muslims. So everything was theoretical. Now they're our neighbors. How do we really deal with the differences? And so this moves us a little further away from that standpoint to talk about inclusivism, or fulfillment, as Knitter puts it. And this is a very interesting point. And there's a picture here of the Catholic theologian Karl Rahner, considered one of the top modern theologians in the Catholic Church. He wrote about a lot of different things, but the thing that he's perhaps best known for is his use of the term anonymous Christians. This is a very interesting concept, that among people of other faiths who have never heard the name of Jesus, and you know there's millions of people in the world that will live their whole lives never hearing the gospel. That's just a reality. And that's what really starts people to think, is God going to condemn people for something they don't know? And this particular viewpoint says God's love is much greater than that. And it's more inclusivist. So this particular viewpoint says that universal provision, the death of Jesus on the cross, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, demands universal access. If Jesus truly is the Word made flesh, the Word who was responsible for creation, then clearly that Word has made its way into the world, and people have access to it even if they've never heard the name Jesus. So this view affirms the first two non-negotiables, that the death of Jesus was, in fact, the central event of history. However, his death and resurrection, and here's those two of those words I learned doing my PhD work. It took me a while to even wrap my mind about what these words mean. His death and resurrection is ontologically, but not epistemologically necessary. So let me unpack those words. Ontologically has to do with being. It was necessary to change our being, the being of every human being, that Jesus died on the cross, having to do with our being. But a faith commitment and a act of repentance and confession is not necessary. Now you see we're moving away from what we all learned. And what that means is among Buddhists and Hindus and Muslims, there are people who are actually in the sphere of Jesus' revelation in a saving way, even though they've never heard the name Jesus, and they've never confessed faith in Jesus. So epistemologically is having to do with knowledge. You don't have to have the knowledge of Jesus in order to be saved. Pretty radical. Interestingly, this viewpoint has had a big influence on Catholic theology. Catholics are actually much more inclusivist in their official understanding of other faiths than many Protestants are. And the other interesting thing was that one of the earliest Christians. He was a martyr, you see by his name. Look at the date. This is like right after the New Testament was written. This gentleman who became a Christian after being a Greek philosopher said that Socrates was a Christian before Christ. Now there's something we can base this on, even going way back, that there were Christians who said it's possible to know Christ without knowing his name. So hang on to that for a minute. And now I'm going to play a clip of a gentleman some of you may know. I've heard him speak. When my daughter heard him speak in Ann Arbor, she said, never sit in the front row with Tony because he spits. He spit at you? Yeah. Literally, so after my daughter said that, I sat in the back row when he was speaking. Tony died a few years ago, but huge influence on evangelical Christianity. His name is Tony Campolo. And I'm going to play a clip now. It's a very bad clip. What I mean by that, the quality isn't so good. You've got to listen carefully. And Steve is going to crank it way up, and Mike's going to crank it way up so we can hear it. So here's Tony Campolo on, you may recognize the PBS show, being interviewed. And listen carefully to what he says. I hope we can hear it. You got to have Jesus. Ontologically, the death and resurrection of Jesus was absolutely necessary to bring about the salvation of the world. But whether or not it's necessary to make a faith commitment when you've never heard about Jesus, is it not possible to find him in other faiths? So he's given a pretty good, interesting example that Jesus was already present in this Buddhist monk's heart and mind. So as the evangelist was talking about him, he was resonating with what he said. So now we're moving away, clearly, from that more traditional view that Jesus is the only way. And now we're going to start going far away with a gentleman named John Hick. And I just found out that Nella Kennedy was the babysitter for Hick's kids when Dr. Kennedy was at Princeton Seminary. And you said they were little terrors? Little heretics. So this was early 60s. John Hick was a professor at Princeton. Am I correct? Yeah. British theologian. And interestingly, he now took those movements towards inclusivism even further. And he said that no religion, including Christianity, has a monopoly on truth. All religions provide soteriological, there's another one of those big words, saving spaces, which means that every one of them allows you to connect with God. But the God that you're connecting with cannot be named because no religion truly understands God. So instead of using the word God, Hick came up with the word the real. And notice the circles now. Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, all are attempts to understand something that is beyond all of them. And that's the real. When I would share this with my students, I said, here's the image. You've got people going up a mountain, and each one of them is going up a different side of the mountain. And they all are groping their way to the peak. And when they meet at the peak, they find out they have the same end. That's the real at the top of the peak. And this is what this is how Hick put it in using fairly academic language. I want to explore the pluralistic hypothesis that the great world faiths embody different perceptions and conceptions of, and correspondingly different responses to the real from within the major variant ways of being human. And that within each of them, the transformation of human existence from self-centeredness to reality-centeredness is taking place. Every religion allows people to move into a saving relationship by moving out of selfishness into a genuine concern for other people. It doesn't matter what the religion is, they're all doing the same thing in different ways. That's Hick's view. And here's an interesting little clip, AI-generated clip, since we were talking about AI this morning, that talks a little bit about Hick's transformation. He started as all of us, Presbyterian, conservative Presbyterian, and here's his journey.
Ever wondered how your belief stacks up against the rest? Let's dive into the mind of philosopher John Hick. Hick started off firmly rooted in Christian faith, but had some serious questions about other religions. In 1967, he made a pivotal move to Birmingham, a city buzzing with different faiths: Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus. As he mingled with diverse communities, his views began to shift. He started seeing common threads. Hick famously posited that all religions are unique responses to a single divine reality. His breakthrough came in 1973, with God and the universe of faiths urging us to rethink our approach to religions. This was all about a paradigm shift, understanding faith as a spectrum rather than a competition. Have you heard the parable of the blind men and the elephant? It perfectly illustrates his point. Each man, touching different parts of the elephant, thought they had the whole truth when in reality, they were just part of it. Like the blind men, different religions offer unique perspectives on the same divine reality.
And I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop there simply because I'm looking at the clock. How many of you heard that story, the elephant and the blind men? Yeah, it's a well-known story. And it sounds very profound. Okay, so we're all blind, we're all groping, and, oh, I think the elephant is a wall. No, the elephant is a tree trunk. No, the elephant is I don't know what else they did. Yeah, whatever it is. But the point was, none of them actually knew what the elephant was. This next view, which now steps outside the traditional views, is a critique of pluralism. But it's a critique from the left side of pluralism, not the right side of pluralism. This takes it even further. And I found this so fascinating that when I was doing PhD studies, I read everything by this particular gentleman who went out to Japan as a fundamentalist missionary. And when he was in Japan, encountered other religion and felt that none of the views that were being touted made any sense. And he was operating out of a postmodern paradigm. When I came back from overseas in 1996, I heard this postmodern. I had no idea what it was. And so I had to work hard to figure out what it was. And I still find it fascinating. Now, I don't even know if it's in vogue anymore, but it is a fascinating way of looking at the world. Postmodernists believe there's no meta-narrative, no one narrative that can handle truth for all people everywhere. They're looking at the world, the pluralism of the world, and what they want to say, and see, because even Hick was talking about a meta-narrative, that's the real. There's one truth. We're groping for it, but there's one truth. And they say, no, there are many truths, including saving truths, because truth in our world is always plural. Why? All human experience and all human knowledge is filtered by our context, and the filters are diverse. It is reductionist to insist that there's a common bond between religions. They are incommensurable. In other words, it is impossible for us to say that, well, Buddhism is like this and Christianity is like this, and look at, we have all these ties. No. All have their own truth. This is almost going back to Henrik Kramer saying every religion is a circle and it has its own truth. But here's the radical thing. Every one of those religions is valid in and of itself. And he wrote a book called Salvations. And in that book, he made these statements. Nirvana, that would be Buddhism and Hinduism, and communion with God are contradictory only if we assume that one or the other must be the sole fate of all human beings. His second book talked about the Trinity. And he said, God is plural in himself, in the Trinity. And God's creation reflects this plurality, including religions. The Trinity is a map that finds room for, indeed requires, concrete truth in other religions. And he made this statement, many true religions, so be it. In other words, Buddhism is absolutely true. Hinduism is absolutely true in and of itself. Christianity is absolutely true. And he advocates that each of these religions should be advocating the truth of their religion, but they have to realize that those people have their truth, and it's just as true. And the picture I leave with my students to help understand this is one that he gave. Think of living in a place where everybody has a gated garden behind their house. And here's Christianity's garden, here's Buddhism's garden, here's Islam's garden, and I'm talking to my neighbor over the fence, and I'm looking, oh, that's a very beautiful garden you have, but it's very different than my garden. And I'm saying, you should look at my garden. I have a beautiful garden too. And we could admire each other's gardens, but each one is valid in and of itself as a beautiful expression of creation. I have a hard time wrapping my mind around this, but it's a very interesting way of looking at it. And he goes even further, and I'm going to end with this. So I've been showing pictures of the circles. So this is what his circles might look like. So Buddhism in and of itself, the entire teaching of Buddhism is true. Absolutely true. So if I'm a Buddhist and I am seeking the path of enlightenment, I will find enlightenment because it's a part of God's creation. That truth of enlightenment, God himself created. Christianity has its own truth with Jesus, God's creation and revelation. Islam has its own truth, leading to its own understanding of heaven. And this is the hard part to get into my mind, but in Hicks, not Hicks, in, what's his name's? Yeah, whatever his name is. There are different heavens, different ends for all these religions, because God has created a pluralistic world, and that includes a pluralistic end for each one of them. So they're all true. If you're pursuing God through the means of the religion you're a part of, you will find the heaven that you're looking for. You don't have to become a Christian to be saved. You can be saved as a Muslim within that system. So Muslims are going to be living in their own paradise, and we're going to be living in the Christian paradise. Because God's world is plural, so is the end. Boy, does that blow my students' minds. Because it blew my mind. So, we do have 15 minutes. Now, I always had an hour and a half for this class, so the students would spend a lot of time on this. But I'd like us to consider this. And since Joash started this, I'm going to follow Joash's lead and ask you to turn to the person next to you or the two people next to you and share your thoughts about this. Which paradigm comes closest to your own perspective? What do you find most attractive about it? You'll never get any further than this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you this. There they are, with a little bit about each one. And I'm curious, as you were hearing this, if there was anything that resonated with your own understanding. It's my theory that every Christian, whether they've gone to seminary or not, has an opinion about other religions It just comes because you have to. How do I deal with this? So we all have our own opinions. I'm just curious if one of the things that was shared here, there may be other options, by the way. These are kind of the main options, resonated with your own understanding. So just take about 7 minutes. That's the perfect number. 7 minutes to have a short discussion of your own thoughts. Just share your ideas with someone next to you. Oh, we've got 8 minutes for each of, not each of you, but some of you to share your thoughts. I really am curious because I have a feeling that we have a range of different ideas here. So Russ, you're eager to share your ideas.
Getting lucky number 7 in the 1972 draft lottery.
Okay, you heard my number about 7.
Yeah. And the Navy recruiter convinced me to join the Navy for 6 years to become a nuclear propulsion engineer. What that required was that I know something about everything in the engine room, how everything was made, how everything worked. I had officers who were my students. They had to please me to get a good grade.
But I'm waiting for you to get to the point.
The point is, family medicine is the same thinking, knowing something about everything
So
at every possible age.
and that other religions too?
Well, that's it.
But now I'm going to challenge you, Russ,
Please.
because knowing about another religion doesn't necessarily mean that you fully accept that other religion.
True.
People who have very strict, more traditional views can spend their days learning about other religions.
Sure.
I'm hopefully going to be writing the biography of Samuel Zwemer. That's my bucket list job right now.
Good job.
And Zwemer was a diehard evangelist his whole life, but he spent his whole life learning about Islam. So learning about another faith doesn't mean that you're necessarily open to accepting another faith.
Well, one thing I had to learn about other faiths was the faiths brought into me by my patients.
Yeah,
Holland had a lot of Southeast Asian families come here in the
Oh, yeah.
1980s, and they bring their own belief
Sure.
systems. And a book I read about 5 years ago that was so helpful, the neural basis of human belief systems.
okay.
We are wired to believe things.
And that of course, might give credence to the more pluralist views that if it's all just neurological, then it doesn't really matter.
I didn't say just neurological.
Oh, okay. Jeff. But thanks, Russ. And we have to have that discussion sometime about the neurological basis of religion. Yeah.
I was thinking about another theological word, telos.
The end.
T-E-L-O-S.
Yeah.
What is the end goal? So what is the end goal of religion? So if you start with the end goal of religion is to figure out who gets to go to heaven and who goes to hell, that obviously changes your perspective on everything. What was interesting to me was that one of the people you quoted, and I can't remember which one, had a different telos when he said that the end goal of religion is to move people away from being self-centered.
Yeah. Oh, that's Hick.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's a different telos
Yeah.
about the purpose of religion, which then would filter everything in your ability to say, how do I relate to
Right.
these others?
And it makes you more open to more pluralist views.
Right. And just the other thing I said in our conversation, that I've just had it. I've had it with Christian superiority. Mm-hmm. I can't live with white superiority, but it's baked into me. And so is Christian superiority. It's
Yep.
been baked into me.
Yep.
And I'm struggling with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think many people are, which is why the more exclusivist position is now being held at arm's length. I think people are looking for, well, okay, I've got to set this one aside. Well, what do I think then? Because my whole life I've been thinking this way. What other alternatives are out there? I must say that's why I find S. Mark Heim's view and the postmodernist view kind of attractive. You can still affirm the truth of Christianity without having to condemn everyone else. Anyone else? Yes. We need a... Yeah, of course.
I have one up here.
Oh, okay.
Believe it or not. Yes,
And
you
then I'll
may.
bring it back.
Okay. Acceptance is that portrait you gave us is sort of like AI. It's like I could tell AI to provide all these, wonderful ends. But in Christian faith, the end isn't heaven. The end is Jesus returning to earth. So
Yeah.
I find that very strange definition. And I find the fulfillment one very satisfying because I know people whose lives have been touched by Jesus who haven't known.
Right. Yeah. And I find that very comforting too. And by the way, if you're really interested in this topic, I do recommend the book that I put up there, because the great thing about Paul Knitter is he presents each case in a positive way. The exclusivist, each one is presented in its most positive way. Then he adds some critiques at the end. But it allows you at least to give consideration to each one of those views.
Okay, I remember that in Dante's Divine Comedy, in the Purgatorio, Dante is climbing up the mountain of purgatory, and on every level, he has a conversation with someone about a serious question. And he poses the question like this. I can't remember who he's talking to, but he says, well, there's a man living on the shore of the Indus River who has never heard of Christ. What's going to happen to him in the afterlife? And the answer is, leave it to God.
Mm-hmm. Which is what Tony Campolo was saying too. Yeah, leave it to God. And that's a good Reformed answer too, I think. Well, really, I mean, one reason I will always be Reformed is the idea of providence says that God is in control. We can relax. We don't have to be thinking that if I don't witness to this person, they don't accept Jesus, they're just going to hell. I don't have to say that because God knows. God determines. Let's have one more. Habib, who grew up in a very interfaith environment.
Yeah, thanks, John, for this. And we had Tony Campolo at Northwestern College in 1991 when I was a freshman.
Yeah, and he came to Northwestern when I was there too.
Yeah,
as a student. Yeah.
But that's not what I'm.
Did you sit in the front row and get spit on?
No,
Oh, that's good.
I was in the middle. The authors are written by Western theologians, and in the back of my mind, I was saying, well, why they are not including Judaism in that circle? In the same level of when they talk about Islam or Buddhism and Christianity. I mean, that's my question.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I could have, of course, put them because they're also one of those religions. What makes Judaism tricky is that Christianity flows out of Judaism, so it's not totally different. We talk about Judeo-Christian ethic in America, and of course, Christian Zionism is based on the idea that God has a special plan for the Jews. And a special plan for Christians, and he will always bless the Jews, and if we don't bless the Jews, we're going to be condemned by God. So it's a trickier area, I think, Habib, don't you think, than when we're talking about different faiths, because Judaism itself and Christianity share those roots. Yeah. You better have the microphone a minute.
If I was writing a book, I would include, from the Eastern perspective, I would include Islam, Judaism, and Christianity as an Abrahamic faith.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, where Islam is not seen as separate from these two religions, and I think the Prophet Muhammad came. And he did not realize that he has created a third one because he came to fix the Christians and the Judaism who strayed from the path of God.
Yep.
And then finally he found out, I have created something different.
Yeah, and in fact, that came about when Jews and Christians rejected him. And he began to move, because originally when Muhammad was alive, they faced Jerusalem when they said their prayers. And then when Jews started pushing back against him, there were Jewish tribes around Mecca, as you know, and they said, "Who are you? You're not a prophet." Suddenly he turned to Mecca for prayers instead. So yeah, also complicated fact with Islam. So I think our time is up. I always watch the clock. And thank you for coming, and I hope you found something interesting and thoughtful. I think I've given you food for thought today. Because, by the way, my whole life, every one of these perspectives in my trying to understand what it means to be a Christian among Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus, because they were in the Gulf as well. I have to say I've gone through every one of these. I sometimes scroll back and forth between them. They all have something valid, I think, to say. And if you really are interested, let me once again recommend Paul Nitter's book. I think it's not too difficult to read, but of course I was reading it during PhD studies, so maybe it is difficult to read. So thank you again. Thank you, Lord.
Thank you, John.